My name is Aurora. I am 68 years old, and on the night of my son's wedding, I felt the sharpest pain a mother can feel, sharper than childbirth, sharper than grief. It happened in front of 200 guests under the glowing chandeliers and the smiling faces of people I had once considered family. I was holding a piece of paper, my carefully written speech, words I had stayed up all night to polish, because I wanted to honor my son on the happiest day of his life. I had even written down memories of when he was a boy, when he used to tug on my dress, asking if he could sleep in my bed during thunderstorms, when he cried after scraping his knees, and I told him he would one day grow strong enough to face the world. I had written words about love, loyalty, and the value of family. I wanted to hand those words to him in front of everyone to remind him where he came from and to bless the woman he was about to marry. But as I stood, my glasses slipping down my nose, my hand trembling, not from age but from overwhelming emotion, I felt a sudden violent shove. It happened so quickly that my body didn't even have time to resist. The paper fell from my fingers, my glasses flew from my face and hit the ballroom floor, and the sound of the lens shattering echoed through the silence that had swallowed the room. I staggered, confused, half blind, and when I looked up, I saw her. My daughter-in-law still in her immaculate white gown, her smile painted like a mask, gripping the microphone as if it were a weapon. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness, dripping with disdain. "This is our night," she hissed, her words amplified by the speakers so that everyone could hear them bounce off the marble walls. "There's no space for selfish speeches about the past. Tonight is about our future, about the life we are about to build. And soon the house that she clings to will be ours." For a moment I thought I had misheard. My own son stood behind her, his eyes cast down, his hands folded in front of him, and he didn't move. Not one word of protest, not one gesture of defense. He stood there as if the woman beside him were the only truth in his world, and I, the mother who had raised him, was nothing more than a burden to be pushed aside. My face burned not from the slap that never came, but from the humiliation that did. 200 eyes turned toward me, some wide with shock, some narrowing with pity, some lowering to avoid meeting mine at all. My knees wobbled as if they were about to betray me too, and I bent down to pick up the broken pieces of my glasses from the polished floor. My hands trembling so badly I could barely gather them. Not one person moved to help me. Not one voice rose in my defense. I crouched there, my whole world collapsing, and I thought of my husband Robert, who had passed away years before. He had promised me that our son would grow up with dignity, that he would know the meaning of loyalty. Yet here I was, abandoned by my blood in the middle of a ballroom, stripped of my role, not only as a mother, but as a human being worthy of respect. The sound of my daughter-in-law's laughter, sharp and triumphant, filled the hall as she raised her glass in a mock toast. To new beginnings, she declared, her eyes never leaving mine, as if the toast was not to the marriage, but to my erasure. I can still hear the silence of that room. Do you know what silence sounds like when 200 people are too afraid to stand for you? It sounds like betrayal, multiplied by every second that ticks by. It sounds like the cracking of your own heart under the weight of humiliation. And I need to ask you, all of you listening now, if your own child stood by while their spouse humiliated you, what would you do? Would you bow your head and swallow the pain, or would you fight back even if it meant tearing apart the very fabric of your family? I stood clutching the pieces of my broken glasses, staring at the woman who had dared to push me aside, and I felt a heat rise inside me that was stronger than my shame. She thought that one shove could silence me forever. She thought that her perfect smile and her cruel words would erase everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed. But what she didn't know was that truth is like fire. It burns quietly at first, then consumes everything in its path. And I was holding that truth even if I hadn't revealed it yet. She went on, speaking her voice floating through the hall, weaving lies about how much she and my son had struggled, about how they deserved better, about how they would finally live in the kind of home worthy of them. Every word was a knife, and every smile a blade twisting deeper. She thought she was celebrating her victory. She thought the crowd was hers, the night was hers, my son was hers. But she had forgotten something vital. She had forgotten that I am not a woman who bows quietly to humiliation. I stayed silent, not because I was broken, but because silence has power when it is pregnant with purpose. I turned my face toward the chandeliers, letting their golden light cover my tears, and I whispered to myself the vow that had just been born in that very moment: this is not the end, this is only the beginning. And so I tell you now, as if I were whispering in your own ear, she thought she had silenced me, but she had only given me a reason to speak louder than I ever had before. She thought she had destroyed my dignity, but she had only given me the fire to defend it. She thought she had taken my son from me, but what she had done was awaken the part of me that still knows how to fight. Mark my words, the truth always finds a microphone. So I'll ask you again. If your child betrayed you on the happiest day of their life, if they stood silent while their spouse humiliated you, would you forgive them? Or would you rise no matter how broken and reclaim your dignity? Comment 1. If you know no child should ever betray their parent, and hit. Like if you believe dignity is worth more than gold, because this story is only just beginning, and you are about to see how the woman they tried to silence turned the entire room into a courtroom. After that night, as I sat in my room clutching the shards of my broken glasses, the memory of the shove would not leave me. But the truth is that humiliation didn't come out of nowhere. No, it had been growing quietly like mold in the corners of my life, ignored, at first tolerated later, until it spread across every wall. I see it clearly now, the small signs, the little daggers wrapped in politeness, the way she had been testing the strength of my silence long before the wedding. I remember the first time she visited my apartment. She was barely engaged to my son, her ring still sparkling new, her smile carefully rehearsed. She walked in and scanned the room, not with curiosity, but with calculation, her eyes sweeping over the old sofa, the lace curtains, the bookshelf stacked with faded photo albums. How cozy, she said, but her tone was not admiration. It was pity mixed with contempt, the kind of voice people use when they compliment a child's drawing, while secretly laughing at its crooked lines. My son didn't notice, or maybe he pretended not to. He laughed, kissed her cheek, and went to pour drinks while I stood there frozen, my heart sinking, though I couldn't say why. It became a pattern. Each time she visited, she would find a new way to remind me that my world was small, outdated, unworthy of her presence. She would run her fingers along the chipped paint of the window frame and sigh. These apartments must be so hard to maintain at your age. She would glance at my old sedan parked outside and murmur, "I can't believe you still drive that. Don't you worry about safety." Her words were cloaked in concern, but the poison always slipped through. I should have recognized it then, but mothers are foolish creatures when it comes to their children. We want so badly to believe our family is safe that we close our eyes to the cracks forming in the walls. The first real warning came on a rainy afternoon. My son came to me with papers in his hand. His expression carefully softened the way he used to look when he wanted a toy from the store and knew I couldn't afford it. "Mom," he said, "this is just a formality. Juliet and I are preparing for the wedding, and the lawyer suggested it would be easier if we consolidated some of the family assets. Nothing changes for you, it protects us in case something happens." His words sounded rehearsed, as though they weren't his but borrowed from someone else. I took the papers from him, my fingers brushing the ink. The letters blurred in the dim light, and though I couldn't read every word, I felt the weight of them pressing against my chest. "Why would I need to sign anything for you two?" I asked, my voice small, almost ashamed of its own suspicion. He smiled the smile of a son trying to reassure his mother. but there was a flicker in his eyes, a shadow that didn't belong there. "It's nothing, Mom. Just paperwork. Trust me." And because trust had been the foundation of my life with him, I almost did. Almost. But when he left the papers on the table and went to take a phone call, I bent closer. The letters swam into focus. I didn't understand all of it, but I recognized the words, title and transfer and authorization. My stomach clenched, and I pulled back as though the paper itself had burned me. I told myself I must be imagining things, that I was tired, that my eyes had betrayed me. When he returned, I signed nothing, and I saw the flash of disappointment cross his face before he hid it behind another smile. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the rain beat against the windows, I wondered if Robert, my late husband, would have seen through it all sooner. He had always been sharper than me, more suspicious of motives. "Appearances deceive," he used to say. "Don't ever believe a smile until you've seen the teeth behind it." I had laughed back then, brushing off his warnings. But as the shadows of the night pressed in, I felt his words return like a ghost whispering in my ear. The next day, I searched the drawer where my son had left the papers. They were gone. He must have taken them with him, perhaps sensing my hesitation. In their place lay a single envelope, white and ordinary, sealed with no name. I picked it up, my heart pounding, but it was empty. Just a decoy, I realized later, a test to see if I would pry. The cunning of it made my stomach twist. Was it his idea or hers? Or were they now one and the same, united in a plan I was too blind to see? Weeks passed and the comments from her sharpened. At a family dinner, she laughed at the way I held my fork, saying, "Oh, Aurora, you're so old-fashioned. Don't worry, we'll modernize things soon." My cheeks burned as my son chuckled beside her, his eyes avoiding mine. The humiliation was a slow poison, not yet lethal, but corroding the bond between us with each sip. Then came the night when I finally allowed myself to admit the possibility of betrayal. I was dusting the shelf in my living room when my hand brushed against the frame of Robert's photograph. The glass wobbled, and behind it, I found something I had never noticed before: a faint smudge of ink on the wall near where the picture had been leaning. I leaned closer, my old eyes narrowing, and realized it was the same kind of ink that had stained the papers my son had once brought me. A coincidence, perhaps, or a trace left by hurried hands moving things, planning hiding. It was in that moment, standing in my quiet apartment with dust clinging to my fingertips, that the first crack of light pierced the darkness. They were planning something, I could feel it. And for the first time, the love that had always blinded me to suspicion began to peel away. I whispered Robert's name as though speaking to the photograph itself, and promised him that I would watch more carefully now. No more excuses. No more silence. But the truth, boss, is that I was still weaker than I wanted to believe. I told myself I would confront them, but when the chance came, I hesitated. I wanted to protect my son, to believe that he was still mine, that he hadn't completely surrendered himself to the woman at his side. I wanted to believe that this was just stress, that after the wedding things would settle. Yet deep down under the layers of denial, I knew. I knew the shove on the wedding night wasn't born in that ballroom. It had been planted in the soil of these smaller humiliations, watered with whispers and paperwork, grown tall in the silence of my own refusal to fight. So when I tell you about the night of the wedding, about the microphone ripped from my hands and the glass shattering on the floor, you must understand it wasn't the beginning. It was the fruit of a tree they had been planting for months, maybe even years. And I ask you again, what would you have done in my place? When you first see the shadows moving against you, do you confront them? Or do you tell yourself it's nothing, only to watch them rise into a storm that consumes everything you love? The second round of betrayal did not come as a sudden blow. It arrived like whispers in the dark, like the faint smell of smoke that seeps through the cracks before the flames ever appear. And it came through someone I had almost forgotten, someone whose voice carried the weight of memory of a past life when loyalty still meant something. Her name was Margaret, a woman I had known for decades. We had worked together at the local library when my son was just a boy. Life had pulled us apart, but she had always lived only a few blocks away, her presence more ghost than neighbor. I hadn't seen her in months, maybe years, until one morning she appeared at the flower shop where I sometimes helped arrange bouquets. Her hair had turned silver. Her hands trembled with age, but her eyes, those sharp, unflinching eyes, had not dulled. She leaned across the counter, lowering her voice as if she were about to confess a crime. "Aurora," she whispered, "I saw something you should know." The words sent a chill down my spine. I set down the ribbon I was tying and asked what she meant. She hesitated, her gaze darting around the empty shop. "I was walking past the cafe on Main Street last week. I saw Juliet there sitting with a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't family, and he wasn't your son. He looked like a lawyer, the way he carried his briefcase, the way his suit fit." They were talking in low voices, leaning close, but I caught a few words as I passed. I heard her say title and transfer, and Aurora. She was smiling. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice trembling, almost pleading for her to say she was mistaken. Margaret's eyes were steady, unflinching. I've lived long enough to know what I saw. She was planning something, and it had to do with your home. I thanked her, though my words felt hollow, as if they had slipped from someone else's lips. When she left, I sat down hard on the stool behind the counter, my legs unable to carry me. The bouquet I had been working on lay unfinished petals, scattered like evidence across the table. My heart pounded in my chest. There it was, confirmation of the dread I had tried to bury. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't the exaggerations of an aging woman. It was real. She was plotting. That night I barely slept. I lay awake, the shadows on the ceiling shifting like specters of betrayal. Every memory of her smirk, every condescending word replayed in my mind with new clarity. She wasn't just cruel, she was calculated. And my son, my only son, was entangled in it, whether by choice or by manipulation. The next morning, I decided I had to know for myself. I followed my instincts to the very same cafe Margaret had mentioned. I sat in the corner by the window, hidden behind a newspaper, my hands trembling as I lifted the cup of coffee to my lips. I waited. Minutes dragged by like hours, and then I saw her. Juliet, immaculate as ever, her hair tied back her dress, sharp and elegant. And with her was the same man Margaret had described. His briefcase lay on the table, papers spread across the polished wood, and his pen scratched across the page with the urgency of someone sealing a deal. I leaned forward, straining to catch their words through the murmur of the cafe. I caught fragments, probate title deed, after the wedding. And then I heard her laugh. It was soft, almost musical, but underneath it, I heard the cruelty, the triumph of someone who believed victory was inevitable. She placed her hand on the man's arm and said, "Once we have that apartment, everything will change." My blood turned to ice. It was no longer suspicion. It was certainty. They wanted my home. The place where Robert and I had built our life, where my son had taken his first steps, where my husband had drawn his last breath in my arms. It wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was memory, history, legacy. And she wanted to claim it as hers, erasing me as though I were an obstacle rather than a mother. I left the cafe before they could see me, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break my ribs. Outside, the cold air slapped my face, but it did nothing to cool the fire rising within me. Betrayal had never felt so tangible, so sharp, so undeniable. And yet, when my son came to visit that evening, his smile warm, his voice gentle, I said nothing. I couldn't bring myself to. He sat at my table eating the stew I had prepared, and I watched him trying to reconcile the boy I had raised with the man who now sat across from me, complicit in my humiliation. "Mom," he said, his tone casual, almost too casual. "Juliet thinks maybe it's time you considered moving to a smaller place. You know, somewhere easier to manage. Less work for you." The words hit me like a blow. I set down my spoon and stared at him, my throat tight. "And where would I go?" I asked quietly. He shifted in his seat, avoiding my gaze. There are nice residences, places with medical staff, social activities. You'd have friends your own age. Juliet even found a brochure. He reached into his pocket and slid a glossy pamphlet across the table. I stared at it, the smiling faces of elderly strangers, grinning up at me from the cover as if mocking my pain. I pushed it back toward him. "This is my home," I said, my voice shaking with both rage and sorrow. "I'm not leaving." For a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, shame, hesitation, maybe even guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. "Just think about it," he murmured, and the conversation shifted to lighter things, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud that refused to break. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, the silence pressing against my chest, I heard a faint sound outside my window. I pulled back the curtain and saw a shadow move quickly down the street. I squinted, my heart racing, and then I saw it, the glint of a phone screen. Someone had been standing there recording, listening, waiting. My stomach twisted. They weren't just talking about it anymore. They were watching me, monitoring me, making sure I wouldn't resist. I closed the curtain, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie the knot. My knees buckled, and I sank into the armchair Robert had once occupied, clutching the fabric as though it could anchor me to a world that was slipping away. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just fighting for bricks and mortar. I was fighting for the memory of my husband, for the dignity of my years, for the right to exist without being erased by the greed of others. The shadows grew longer, and with them my fear, but fear, I would later learn, has its uses. It sharpens the eyes. It makes you notice things you once ignored. And in the silence of that night, I vowed that I would notice everything from now on. No more blindness, no more naivety. If they wanted war, they would find that even an old woman can wield a weapon called truth. But in that moment, I was still alone, still uncertain, still clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, my son would come to his senses before it was too late. That hope was the only thing that kept me from collapsing entirely. What I didn't know was that the storm had only just begun, and the people I thought I could trust were already building the cage they intended to lock me in. And so I ask you again, those who listen to my story, when you hear whispers behind your back, when you see shadows watching your home, when even your own child begins to echo the words of a stranger, what do? Do you stay silent and hope it passes, or do you prepare for the fight of your life, knowing that silence may cost you everything you have ever loved? If betrayal first whispers, then it grows louder, until one day it becomes a chorus, sung by the very people who once swore they loved you. That was the lesson I learned at the family dinner 2 weeks before the wedding, a night that carved itself into my chest like a scar that refuses to fade. The dinner had been Juliet's idea, of course. She called it a family bonding evening, a chance for everyone to gather and celebrate before the big day. She chose the restaurant, a new and expensive one, with glittering chandeliers and tables dressed in white linen, a place so polished that even the waiters looked like they had been cut from marble. I was uncomfortable the moment I walked in. My clothes were simple, my shoes a little worn, and I could feel the eyes of the hostess flicker over me with polite dismissal. But I told myself this was for my son, for his happiness, and I pressed on. The moment I sat down, I knew I didn't belong at that table. Juliet's parents were there, dressed to impress their voices, dripping with condescension masked as charm. They greeted me with smiles that never reached their eyes, and their conversation flowed easily with Juliet but stumbled when it reached me as though I were a foreign language they didn't care to learn. My son sat between Juliet and her father, his posture stiff. His laugh forced his eyes darting away whenever I looked at him. At first, the conversation was harmless. They spoke about honeymoon plans, about the wedding cake, about the guest list. I tried to join in, asking simple questions, but each time Juliet would answer with a tone that sliced like a blade, her words polished enough to appear polite, but cruel enough to make everyone else smirk. "Don't worry, Aurora," she said when I asked about the seating arrangement. "You'll be seated where you won't have to walk too much. We don't want you getting tired." The table chuckled. Even my son and I forced a smile while my insides crumbled. But it was when the wine was poured that the true humiliation began. Juliet lifted her glass and said, "We're so blessed to finally build our future. And of course, once we move into a proper home, we'll finally have the space we deserve." She looked at me when she said it, her eyes glinting with triumph. "It's time for new generations to take over, don't you think?" Her father nodded approvingly. "It's the natural order of things," he said, his voice heavy with authority. "Parents pass the torch to their children. Houses, businesses, opportunities, these things belong to the young. It's how families thrive." I felt my throat tighten. "That may be true," I said softly, "but respect is also part of the natural order. A parent isn't discarded just because they grow old." The table grew quiet for a moment, but Juliet broke the silence with a laugh so sharp it could cut glass. "Aurora, don't be so dramatic. No one is discarding you. We just think it's time for you to enjoy peace without worrying about such big responsibilities. You deserve to rest." It was a masterstroke of manipulation, framing theft as kindness, erasure as generosity. And the worst part was seeing my son nod along his head, bent in agreement. My own flesh agreeing to the dismantling of my dignity. As the night went on, the comments piled up. Juliet's mother leaned across the table, her perfume suffocating, and asked Aurora, "Dear, how do you manage on such a small pension? It must be difficult to survive these days." She smiled sweetly, but her eyes flicked toward her daughter, a silent exchange of triumph. I wanted to scream, to stand and throw the glass of water in her face, but instead I clenched my hands in my lap until my nails dug crescents into my skin. I excused myself halfway through the meal, saying I needed some air. Outside, I leaned against the cold brick wall of the restaurant, my chest heaving. I felt like a stranger in my own family, like a ghost wandering among people who no longer saw me. I thought of Robert again, how he would have roared with anger at such disrespect, how he would have slammed his fist on the table and silenced them all. But Robert was gone, and all that was left was me, tired, aging, and seemingly defenseless. When I returned to the table, the final blow came. Juliet raised her glass again and said, "To our future home." And then, with a smile that froze the blood in my veins, she added, "And to the generosity of those who understand that their time has passed." The table erupted in cheers. My son raised his glass, clinking it against hers. I sat motionless, my own glass untouched, my heart shattering in my chest. After dinner, as we walked to the parking lot, I lagged behind. My son turned briefly and asked if I was all right. I wanted to tell him everything that I knew about the lawyer, about the whispers, about the brochures. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I nodded and said I'm fine. He smiled, faintly relieved, and hurried back to Juliet's side. When I reached my car, I saw something glinting on the ground beneath the driver's side door. I bent down and picked it up. It was a small flash drive, black and unmarked. At first I thought someone must have dropped it, but when I looked closer, I saw faint scratches on the casing, like it had been handled roughly. My stomach churned. I slipped it into my purse, my hands trembling, and drove home in silence, my mind racing. That night, I couldn't resist. I plugged the drive into my old laptop, the screen flickering to life in the darkness of my living room. At first, the files seemed ordinary documents, contracts, spreadsheets. But then I opened one audio file and my blood turned cold. It was a recording, muffled but clear enough. I heard Juliet's voice, calm and cold. "After the wedding, the apartment will be ours. She won't resist. She can't. She's too weak. And if she does, we'll take legal measures. Ethan is ready to sign whatever we need." And then my son's voice. My son. "She'll believe me if I say it's for her safety. She always does. Don't worry, Juliet. She won't stand in our way." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Hearing it was worse than suspecting it. To know that my son had spoken those words, had plotted against me with her, tore through me like a knife. I slammed the laptop shut, my chest, heaving, tears streaming down my face. The flash drive lay on the table like a curse, a black object heavy with betrayal. I stumbled to the bedroom, collapsing onto Robert's old armchair, clutching the sweater he used to wear. I pressed it to my face, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of him, and sobbed until my body ached. I wanted to believe it was all a mistake, that my son was trapped, manipulated, coerced. But the recording was clear. His voice was calm, certain complicit. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I watered the plants, I swept the floor, I baked bread the way I used to when Ethan was a boy. But everything felt hollow, like acting out a play for an audience that no longer cared. I was a ghost haunting my own home. And yet beneath the despair, something else stirred. Anger. Real burning anger. Not the quiet frustration I had carried before, but a fire that licked at the edges of my grief. They thought I was weak, too old, too tired to fight. But they had forgotten one thing: steel hardens with fire. And I had lived through enough fire in my life to know I was not finished yet. Still in that moment, I felt the crushing weight of isolation. I had no allies. My family had turned against me. My son was no longer mine. And everywhere I went, I felt the eyes of strangers, as if the world had already decided I was irrelevant, disposable. I ask you, those who hear my voice, have you ever been betrayed so completely that even your own child became a stranger? Have you ever sat in silence, clutching proof of your own erasure, wondering if anyone would ever stand beside you again? That was my world then, a world collapsing yet silently preparing for the storm to come. There comes a moment in every storm when you stop wondering if the house will hold and begin to accept that the roof might collapse on top of you. That was where I found myself in the days leading up to the wedding. After the dinner, after the flash drive, after the recording of my son's voice betraying me with such ease, I felt like the walls of my life were closing in, suffocating me in a silence heavier than stone. I remember the night before the rehearsal dinner. The city was alive with laughter, with music drifting from bars and restaurants, with young couples holding hands, as if the world belonged to them. I sat in my apartment in the armchair that had once belonged to Robert, staring at the photograph of him smiling in our garden, his arm around me, his eyes filled with warmth I hadn't seen in years. I poured myself a glass of red wine, though I rarely drank, and whispered his name like a prayer. "Robert," I said, my voice breaking. I tried to be strong. I tried to raise him the way we promised, but he's gone. He's hers now. What do I do? The picture gave no answer, only stared back with the stillness of the past. Tears blurred my vision, hot and relentless, until I pressed my sleeve against my face to wipe them away. The wine glass shook in my hand. For a terrible moment, I thought of smashing it against the wall, of letting the shards scatter like my broken heart. But I set it down carefully instead, as though the simple act of control was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. I barely slept that night. I tossed in bed, haunted by the words from the recording. She won't resist. She can't. She's too weak. His voice looped in my mind until I almost wished for silence, even if it meant the silence of the grave. I remembered the nights when he was small, when storms rattled the windows, and he would crawl into my bed whispering, "Mom, I'm scared." And I would hold him whispering back, "You're safe. I'll always protect you." How bitter those words tasted now, when the boy I protected had grown into a man who saw me not as a mother, but as an obstacle. The next day, the rehearsal dinner unfolded like a theater performance, where I was the unwanted extra. Juliet had orchestrated everything: who spoke where people sat, which songs played. My role was silence. I sat at the edge of the table, ignored except for the occasional glance filled with pity or annoyance. Every time I opened my mouth, Juliet's voice would rise louder, cutting me off, redirecting the conversation. My son never intervened. He laughed when she laughed, nodded when she nodded, his entire being orbiting around her as though I were invisible. At one point, Juliet clinked her glass for attention. "I want to thank everyone for supporting us," she said, her smile dazzling, her words rehearsed. "This is the beginning of a new chapter, And part of starting fresh means letting go of the past, even if that past clings too tightly. Her eyes slid toward me just for a second, sharp enough that I felt the sting like a slap. The table chuckled politely, but I felt the heat rise in my cheeks until I thought my skin might burn. I excused myself to the restroom, locking the door and gripping the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles whitened. I stared into the mirror at the woman reflected there, hair-thinning lines etched deep eyes, ringed with exhaustion. I barely recognized myself. I leaned closer, whispering, "You have to hold on, just hold on." But the reflection only looked back with silent despair. When I returned, no one seemed to have noticed my absence. That somehow hurt even more. That night back in my apartment, the loneliness was unbearable. I sat at the kitchen table, the flash drive still lying there, like an unholy relic. I replayed the recording once more, though it felt like stabbing myself willingly, each word sliced anew. "She's too weak." My son's voice steady, confident. He believed it. He truly believed I would fold, that I would surrender everything without a fight. For a moment, I considered giving in. I thought of packing a suitcase, of leaving quietly before the wedding, of moving into some small, sterile apartment where no one knew my name. I imagined them walking into my home, celebrating their victory, toasting with champagne as if they had conquered a kingdom. The thought made me sick, but part of me wondered if it would be easier than enduring the humiliation of the fight. I went to my bedroom and opened the closet. My suitcase sat on the shelf, dusty from years of neglect. I pulled it down and set it on the bed. My hands trembled as I reached for my clothes. The idea of leaving everything behind the apartment, the memories, the life Robert and I had built, was unbearable. But the idea of staying and being destroyed by them felt worse. I sat on the bed staring at the suitcase, tears streaming down my face. I felt old, useless, disposable. I whispered into the empty room. Maybe they're right. Maybe my time has passed. And then, like a cruel trick, my mind filled with memories. Robert's laughter as we painted the living room streaks of white across his cheek. The sound of Ethan's first cry in the hospital, tiny fists clenched, fragile, but full of life. The Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the floor, the smell of cinnamon rolls in the oven. The roses Robert planted outside still blooming every spring, even after he was gone. My life was etched into the walls of this apartment. Leaving it would not just be surrender, it would be erasing myself entirely. I closed the suitcase and shoved it back into the closet, collapsing onto the bed. I sobbed until my throat ached, until my eyes burned, until I had nothing left but emptiness. The days that followed blurred together. I moved like a ghost through my routines, watering the plants, cooking meals I barely ate, sitting in silence as the hours stretched long. The weight of despair pressed down until even breathing felt like labor. My body ached, my spirit fractured. I thought of calling Margaret, of confessing everything to her, but shame kept me silent. What could I say that I had raised a son who betrayed me, that I had become a woman erased by her own family? It was on the eve of the wedding that the breaking point came. The city was quiet outside my window, the hum of distant traffic, a lullaby for strangers. I sat in Robert's chair again, clutching the flash drive, whispering his name. Robert. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I have the strength. The words dissolved into sobs. For the first time, I felt truly defeated, as if the fight had already been lost before it began. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was the sound. A knock at the door, sharp, deliberate, echoing through the silence of the apartment. I froze, my heart thundering. Who could it be at this hour? Another knock, louder this time. I rose slowly, my legs trembling, and shuffled to the door. My hand hovered over the knob, hesitation anchoring me in place. A third knock came urgent now. I swallowed hard and pulled the door open. There he stood, a man I had never seen before, tall with lines etched deep into his weathered face, eyes dark and serious. He wore a heavy coat, rain dripping from the shoulders, and in his hand he held a small leather folder. "Mrs. Aurora Hughes?" he asked, his voice low, steady. "Yes," I whispered, my throat dry. He glanced around the hallway, then leaned closer. "I know what they're planning against you." My breath caught. The world tilted. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice barely audible. He held up the folder, tapping it with his fingers. "Someone who has proof. Proof that your son and his fiancée are conspiring to take everything from you. And if you want to stop them, you need to see this." I stared at him, my mind spinning, torn between fear and the faint spark of hope. For weeks I had felt alone, cornered, powerless. And now here was a stranger on my doorstep, offering something I didn't dare believe in, an ally perhaps, or a weapon. The silence stretched between us, thick with uncertainty, until finally I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. My voice no longer trembled. The man stepped into my apartment as though he were stepping into a confessional, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. For a moment, the silence between us was unbearable. The only sound was the faint dripping of rain from his coat onto my worn rug. His eyes scanned the room. Robert's chair, the photographs on the wall, the plants lined up by the window, and then returned to me, steady, unflinching. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said, finally setting the leather folder down on the kitchen table. "I knew Robert a long time ago, before you and he decided to live quietly. He helped me once when no one else would, and I never forgot it. That's why I'm here." Hearing Robert's name from his lips was like feeling a hand reach through the grave to steady me. I swallowed hard, my voice breaking. "You knew my husband." He nodded. "We worked together briefly. He saved me from a ruinous deal. Said family was worth more than money. He lived by that. And when I heard whispers about what your son and his fiancée were planning, I couldn't stay silent." My knees nearly buckled. I sank into the chair across from him, clutching the table edge. "What do you know?" He opened the folder, sliding a stack of documents toward me. My hands trembled as I lifted the first page. It was a copy of a contract stamped with a notary's seal. My eyes caught the words, "Transfer of property," and beneath them, my own address, my apartment, the place I had built my life. The signatures were blank, but the space had already been prepared for mine or for a forged imitation. I turned the page. More documents, power of attorney drafts, letters from a real estate agency, even an email printout where Juliet's name was mentioned in connection with a probate strategy. Each page was a knife, but also a revelation. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't paranoid. They truly were conspiring to erase me. Daniel's voice was calm, steady. "They've been working with a lawyer, an ambitious young man who thinks this case will make his career. They plan to pressure you into signing after the wedding, or failing that argue that you are no longer capable of making rational decisions. They want to declare you incompetent, Aurora. That way they don't need your consent at all." The words struck like lightning. I felt heat rise in my chest, rage mingling with fear. "Incompetent," I whispered. "They would dare." He nodded grimly. "They've been gathering little things, comments, observations, moments of forgetfulness, and twisting them into evidence. They'll paint you as fragile, confused, vulnerable. And the court? Well, courts can be cruel when there's money on the table." For a moment, I could hardly breathe. I thought of the dinner, of Juliet's sharp jokes about my age, of the pamphlet for senior residences. All of it had been preparation setting the stage. My humiliation was not random, it was strategy. I stared down at the papers, the words blurring through tears. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Because Robert once protected me and I owe him. And because you are not as alone as you think. I can connect you with people who know how to fight this. But first, you must decide if you have the will to fight. Do you?" The question echoed inside me. For weeks I had felt broken, powerless. I had nearly packed my suitcase, nearly walked away from my own life. But now, staring at the evidence of their treachery, something inside me hardened. The sorrow did not vanish, but it transformed, turning into a fire that burned through my veins. I lifted my head, meeting his eyes. "Yes," I said, my voice low but steady. "I will fight." He gave a single nod as though he had been waiting for that answer. Good. Tomorrow I'll introduce you to someone who can help. She's young, but sharp a lawyer with a reputation for tearing fraud apart. Her name is Imogen Ward. She doesn't lose. The name meant nothing to me then, but the promise behind it lit a spark of hope. Daniel gathered the documents back into the folder, leaving copies for me. Keep these safe. Do not mention them to anyone. And until the wedding, play your role. Let them think you are broken. Let them believe they've won. The element of surprise is your ally. After he left, I sat alone at the table staring at the papers. For the first time in months, I did not feel like prey. I felt like a witness who had finally found her testimony. The despair that had nearly drowned me began to transform into something sharper, more dangerous. I stood and walked to the mirror in the hallway. The woman staring back was still tired, still aged, still scarred, but in her eyes was something new, resolve. I whispered to my reflection, "They think I'm weak. They think I'll surrender. But they've forgotten who raised this family. They've forgotten who I am." I slept that night for the first time in weeks. It was not peaceful sleep, but it was sleep laced with purpose. When I woke in the morning, the sunlight streamed through the curtains like a benediction. I made coffee, fed the plants, and sat at the table with the documents. I studied each one, committing every detail to memory. Every word was a weapon. Every signature line was a battlefield. By midday, I felt steady enough to walk outside. The air was cool, the city alive, and for the first time in months, I did not feel like a ghost. I felt like a soldier preparing for war. My steps were slow but firm, each one echoing the vow I had whispered to Robert's photograph, "I will not be erased." When I returned home, I opened the flash drive again. This time, the recording of my son's voice no longer shattered me. It fueled me. She won't resist. She can't. She's too weak. I played it again and again, each repetition strengthening my resolve. He had declared me weak. He had underestimated me. That was his mistake. That would be his undoing. That evening, I sat down to write. Not a speech, not yet, but notes. Memories, records, everything I could recall about the humiliations, the comments, the attempts to manipulate me. I filled pages with details, my handwriting uneven but determined. It was not just therapy. It was evidence. My own testimony prepared for the day they would try to silence me again. As the hours passed, I felt Robert's presence in the room, not as a ghost, but as a memory solid enough to steady me. He'd always said truth is steel. It bends under heat but never breaks. For the first time since he died, I believed him again. When I finally set the pen down, I looked at the last line I had written. My hand had scrawled it in a rush of fury, the letters jagged and sharp. They will regret underestimating me. And so, I tell you now, those listening to my story, they thought they had me cornered, broken, erased. But all they had done was awaken a fire I thought had died long ago. Do you understand? Sometimes taking everything from someone gives them the very weapon they need to fight back. Sometimes the only way to awaken strength is to wound dignity so deeply it has no choice but to rise. I looked at the clock, the hours ticking closer to the wedding. For the first time, I did not dread it. For the first time, I saw it not as a stage for my humiliation, but as a battlefield where the truth would finally roar. So I ask you again, if someone conspired to erase your life, to strip you of dignity and call you weak, would you surrender, or would you let that insult ignite the fire inside you? Comment 1. If you would fight with everything left in you and hit. Like if you believe truth, once revealed, can never be silenced. B. Because the storm was no longer something to fear. The storm was mine to unleash. The morning of the wedding dawned bright, too bright as if the sun itself had chosen to mock me. The city was alive with joy, bells ringing from churches, children laughing in the streets, cars decorated with ribbons carrying guests in their finest clothes. But inside me there was no joy. There was only fire. I dressed slowly, carefully in a modest dress of navy blue. It was not new, but it was pressed, spotless, dignified. I wanted no one to say I looked like a beggar at my own son's wedding. Dignity was the only armor I had left. The church was grand, every corner, adorned with white roses and candles that flickered like 100 tiny witnesses. Guests filled the pews, their chatter rising like a tide, but I hardly heard them. My mind was sharp, my heart steady. I clutched my small purse close to my chest. Inside it, the folder Daniel had given me, the flash drive, and my notes. Weapons, all of them, though no one else knew it. It was just before the ceremony when fate gave me the first chance to strike. I had stepped into the side corridor away from the crowd to collect myself. That was when I saw her. Juliet stood in the bridal dressing room, her white gown cascading around her like a river of silk. Her bridesmaids had stepped out, leaving her alone with the mirror. She was adjusting her veil, humming softly to herself, her smile so self-satisfied it made my blood boil. Before I knew what I was doing, I pushed the door open. The sound startled her. She turned, and when her eyes met mine, the smile faltered for just a second. But then it returned sharper, crueler. "Well, look who decided to show her face," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Shouldn't you be hiding in some corner where you won't embarrass yourself again?" I closed the door behind me, the click echoing like a gunshot. My heart pounded, but my voice was calm, steady. "I'm not here to embarrass myself. I'm here to remind you who I am." She laughed high and brittle. "Who you are. You're nothing but an old woman clinging to a past that doesn't matter anymore. This is my day, my house, soon my future, my husband. You're a footnote." Her words sliced, but this time I didn't flinch. I stepped closer, my heels striking the floor like drum beats. "You think marriage makes you owner of my life? You think you can erase me with a ring and a smile? Let me tell you something, Juliet. You may have my son's ear, but you do not have his blood. His blood is mine. His life is built on my sacrifices, my labor, my love. You stand here in silk because I worked myself to the bone for decades. Do not mistake silence for surrender." Her eyes narrowed, her composure cracking. She set down her bouquet, her fingers tightening around the ribbon. "You're pathetic, always playing the martyr, always clinging to that apartment like it's worth anything. Do you know what Ethan calls it when you're not around a prison? He says he feels suffocated every time he visits you. That's why he wants out. That's why he wants me." The words hit hard, but I refused to let her see the wound. I straightened my back, lifting my chin. "If he truly feels that way, then it is because of you. You poisoned him, turned him against his own mother. But I promise you, this, what you're building, is not a future. It's a cage made of lies, and when it collapses, you will be buried inside it." She smirked, stepping closer until her perfume filled my lungs. Bold words. "But let's be honest, you don't have the strength to fight me. Everyone knows it. You're weak, fragile. That's why no one will believe you when you scream. That's why the court will take my side. You should just accept it now, and maybe I'll let you keep a room in your precious apartment until you die." I stared at her, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from fury. For weeks she had called me weak, fragile, irrelevant. And for weeks I had believed it, but not anymore. "Weak," I said, my voice low-cutting. "I raised a child alone after his father died. I worked nights to pay for his education. I stood by him when he stumbled, when he made mistakes, when he needed me. Weak is a woman who steals instead of builds. Weak is a woman who hides behind manipulation because she has no strength of her own. You call me weak. You don't know the meaning of strength." Her smile faltered. Just for a heartbeat, I saw it the flicker of fear. She masked it quickly, but I caught it, and that was enough. I leaned in my lips, almost at her ear. "Enjoy this moment, Juliet. Enjoy the flowers, the candles, the applause. Because it's the last applause you'll ever hear. After today, your name will not be remembered as a bride's, but as a fraud's." She recoiled, her eyes blazing. "You wouldn't dare!" I met her gaze unflinching. "Watch me." For a long moment, the room was silent, the air thick with our hatred. The sound of distant music drifted from the main hall, muffled but insistent, like a reminder that the performance was about to begin. She lifted her chin, trying to regain control, and snatched her bouquet back from the table. "You'll regret this," she spat. "When Ethan and I stand at the altar, you'll see who truly holds the power." I turned to the door, my hand on the knob. "No, Juliet," I said softly, but with steel in my tone. "The whole world will see, and it won't be you." I left her there, her face pale beneath the makeup, her eyes following me with a mixture of fury and unease. For the first time, I had faced her not as prey, but as equal combatant. And though the real battle was yet to come, I knew I had already cracked her mask. As I stepped back into the corridor, the sound of the organ began to swell, calling guests to their seats. I clutched my purse tighter, feeling the weight of the documents inside, and whispered to myself, "This is it. No more hiding." The air in the church was heavy with expectation. The guests shifted in their seats, their voices a murmur beneath the rising swell of the organ. White roses lined the aisle, candles flickered in golden holders, and the stained glass windows painted the floor in shades of crimson and blue. To anyone else, it was a fairy tale scene. To me, it was an arena, and the battle was about to begin. I sat in the pew, reserved for family, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my purse resting beside me. Inside that purse were my weapons, the flash drive, the documents Daniel had given me, the notes I had written through tears and rage. My heart pounded, but my face was calm. The woman who had nearly packed her suitcase to surrender was gone. I had come not as a victim, but as a witness, and I was ready. The music shifted, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. Juliet appeared radiant in her gown, her smile dazzling, her hand clutching my son's arm. The crowd gasped in admiration, some even wiping tears of joy. My son's face was stiff as though carved from stone, his eyes forward, his hand gripping hers with the weight of inevitability. They walked slowly down the aisle, each step echoing like a drumbeat of betrayal. I watched my chest tightening. Once long ago, I had dreamed of this day of standing proudly as my son married a woman who would cherish him, who would welcome me as family. Instead, I sat alone knowing that the woman beside him was not a bride, but a thief, dressed in silk. They reached the altar. The officiant raised his hands, speaking words about love and unity, about vows and promises. His voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling, but the words rang hollow in my ears. I saw Juliet glance at me from the corner of her eye, her smile curling smug. She believed she had already won. The ceremony continued. They exchanged vows, hers, sweet, and practiced his hesitant but binding. Rings slid onto fingers. Applause rippled through the church. And then, just as the officiant prepared to pronounce them, husband and wife, Juliet raised her hand. "Before we finish," she said, her voice loud and clear, "I would like to say something." The crowd hushed. She turned, facing the guests, her veil shimmering in the candlelight. "Today is not just the beginning of our marriage. It is the beginning of our new life in our new home. We are blessed not only with love, but with the chance to build a future free of burden, free of the past." Her eyes locked on mine, sharp and cruel. A murmur swept the pews. My hands tightened around the edge of the bench. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the moment pressing in on me. This was it. I stood. The sound of my chair scraping the floor echoed through the silence. All eyes turned toward me. My voice, though trembling, at first grew steady as I spoke. "No, Juliet, this is not the beginning of your life. This is the beginning of your downfall." Gasps filled the church. My son's head whipped toward me, his eyes wide with shock. Juliet's smile faltered just for a second before she recovered. "Aurora," she said sweetly, her tone dripping with false innocence, "please sit down. Don't embarrass yourself again." I stepped into the aisle, my heels clicking against the stone floor, my hand gripping the purse at my side. "I have been silent long enough. I let you mock me, humiliate me, even turn my son against me. But today, in front of God and everyone here, the truth will speak louder than your lies." The officiant looked uncertain, glancing between us. The guests leaned forward breathless. Juliet laughed brittle. What truth? That you're an old woman afraid of being left behind, that you can't let go of a dusty apartment that should have been ours months ago. My son's voice rose harsh defensive. Mom, stop, this isn't the time. I turned to him, my eyes burning. Not the time, Ethan, this is the only time left. Look at me. Look at what you've become. Do you even recognize yourself? He faltered, his mouth opening, but no words coming. Juliet stepped forward, seizing control. Enough. She's just jealous. Bitter. Everyone knows she's been struggling. Everyone knows she can't manage anymore. This is pathetic. That was when I reached into my purse. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled out the flash drive, holding it high so the light caught the black casing. Pathetic, I said, my voice steady. Pathetic is plotting against your own family. Pathetic is conspiring with lawyers to strip a mother of her home. Pathetic is believing no one will ever find out. But I found out. Juliet's face drained of color. The crowd erupted in whispers. My son looked as though the ground had vanished beneath him. I have recordings, I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. Recordings of you, Juliet, laughing about how you would take my apartment. And you, Ethan, agreeing that I was too weak to resist. Do you deny it? Shall I play it for everyone here? Juliet stammered, her confidence cracking. That's not possible. You're lying. You don't have... I cut her off. I have it. I heard your voices. Every word. And I have documents. Proof that you and your allies planned to declare me incompetent, to erase me, so you could steal what Robert and I built with our blood. Do you still want me to sit quietly? The silence in the church was absolute. Then a voice rose from the back, Margaret, my old friend, who had slipped in unnoticed. She's telling the truth. I saw Juliet with that lawyer. I heard the words myself. Another voice joined the hotel manager Daniel had introduced me to, and I saw them signing drafts. I warned her. They planned this for months. The crowd turned, whispers rising like a wave. Juliet's parents looked pale, their carefully constructed facade collapsing. Juliet's hands shook, clutching her bouquet as if it could shield her from the truth. My son's voice cracked. Mom, please! I faced him, tears filling my eyes, but not weakening my resolve. Please, what, Ethan? Please pretend I didn't hear you call me weak. Please ignore the way you plotted with her to erase me. No, my son. The time for silence is over. Juliet's mask shattered. She dropped the bouquet, her voice shrill. You don't understand. He was mine. His life is mine. And so is that apartment. You've had your time, old woman. It's over. Gasps rippled through the guests. The officiant stepped back, horrified. My son buried his face in his hands. I stepped closer, my voice low but cutting through the room. No, Juliet. It's you who don't understand. Love built this home. Sacrifice built this family. And the moment you tried to steal it, you revealed who you truly are. You will never be remembered as a bride, only as a thief. For a long, terrible moment, the church was silent. Then slowly the whispers turned into open condemnation. Guests shook their heads. Some stood and walked out in disgust. Juliet's parents tried to quiet the crowd, but their voices were drowned out by the rising tide. My son looked at me, his face twisted with regret, with shame. Mom, he whispered, his voice breaking. But I could not answer him. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too raw. I turned back to the officiant, who looked bewildered, caught between duty and shock. This ceremony, I said firmly, should not continue. Not with lies, not with fraud. Let the truth stand here, today instead. The officiant hesitated, then slowly nodded. Perhaps it is best that we pause. Juliet let out a scream high and wild. She lunged toward me, her hands reaching for the flash drive, her veil slipping from her hair. But Daniel appeared from the aisle, stepping between us, his hand raised. Enough, he said, his voice like steel. You've done enough damage. The guests watched in stunned silence as Juliet crumbled, falling to her knees, her gown pooling around her like a broken illusion. My son knelt beside her, torn between loyalty and horror, his hands shaking as he tried to lift her. But she pushed him away, her eyes blazing with hatred, not at him, but at me. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You'll regret this. I'll take everything from you, even if it's the last thing I do." I met her gaze, my voice steady. "You've already lost everything that matters. Dignity, trust, respect. Without those, even palaces are empty." The officiant closed his book. The ceremony was over. Guests began to leave, murmuring, shaking their heads. Some came to me, placing gentle hands on my shoulder, whispering words of support. Others avoided my eyes, too stunned by the spectacle they had just witnessed. As the candles flickered and the roses wilted under the weight of silence, I stood in the aisle, my back straight, my eyes fixed ahead. I had been humiliated, mocked, betrayed. But now, in front of everyone, I had reclaimed my voice. The truth had spoken. And though the war was not yet finished, the first battle had been won. The wedding was supposed to be a celebration of love, but what remained inside that church felt more like a courtroom. The music had stopped, the officiant had closed his book, and the silence was pierced only by the murmur of guests whispering the truth to one another. Juliet still knelt on the floor in her ruined gown, her veil torn, her eyes wild with fury. My son hovered beside her, trembling, caught between shame and loyalty. But the most important shift had already begun. The crowd was no longer passive. The crowd had turned into witnesses. Margaret, my old friend, stood tall despite her frail frame. She walked into the center aisle, her voice clear, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I saw her," she declared, pointing at Juliet. "I saw her in the cafe with that lawyer. I heard the words title and transfer." She was planning this long before today. Her voice did not tremble. It rang with the weight of age and truth. The manager Daniel had introduced me to stepped forward next. He pulled a small envelope from his coat, lifting it high for all to see. "I have records," he said. "Signatures, drafts, proof that this was a conspiracy to steal her home. I warned Aurora, but she was too kind to believe it at first. Now you all see who the liar is." The guests gasped, heads swiveling, eyes narrowing toward Juliet and her family. The weight of evidence was no longer hidden in folders or flash drives. It had stepped into the open, carried by voices other than mine. And in that moment, the power shifted entirely. It was no longer my word against theirs. It was community against corruption. Juliet's parents tried to recover the crumbling narrative. Her father raised his voice, booming across the room. "This is slander. You can't ruin our daughter's wedding with lies from jealous old women and bitter strangers." But his words were drowned out by the rising tide. More guests stood one after another. I saw the brochures, whispered one cousin, her voice growing louder. Juliet bragged about putting Aurora in a home. She told me at the salon another woman added, her eyes wide. She said the apartment would be hers by summer. Voices layered on voices until the church was alive with condemnation. Juliet clutched her head, shaking it furiously. "They're lying. They're all lying," she screamed. But the more she protested, the louder the whispers grew. I stood still, my hands clasped in front of me. I did not need to raise my voice anymore. The truth was carrying itself, now ignited by every witness, spreading like fire across dry wood. What had once been my private humiliation had become a public reckoning. My son, pale and trembling, looked around desperately. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Please stop. This isn't how it was supposed to go." But no one listened. The tide had turned, and there was no stopping it. Even the officiant, normally a man of neutrality, stepped forward with a solemn expression. "This house of God cannot bless a union built on deceit. Whatever vows were spoken here are already broken." His words fell like judgment, final and devastating. Guests began leaving in groups, shaking their heads, muttering about scandal, betrayal, disgrace. Some stopped by me, pressing my hand, whispering, "We believe you." Others simply nodded, their eyes full of sorrow but also respect. The shame that Juliet had tried to heap on me had turned and swallowed her whole. As the last of the witnesses spoke, the air shifted. The church was no longer heavy with humiliation. It was heavy with justice. I felt the weight of months of silence lift from my shoulders. I had not needed to scream or beg. All I had needed was the truth and the courage to let it burn. I turned once more to the guests who remained and spoke, my voice strong but calm. Thank you. Thank you for standing with me. For too long I carried this burden alone. But now you've seen it. Now the world has seen it. Dignity is not a luxury. It is the foundation of who we are. And no one, no bride, no son, no stranger, has the right to steal it. Applause rose hesitant at first, then stronger, echoing through the rafters. It was not applause for a wedding. It was applause for truth. I stepped back to my pew, my head high, my heart steady. The fire had spread, and nothing Juliet or her family did could put it out now. The story was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it, everyone who would carry it beyond the church walls into the city, into the world. And as I sat down, I whispered to myself, the battle is not finished, but the tide has turned. They wanted silence. They got fire. When the last guest left the church, the silence that remained was almost unbearable. The roses still glowed white on the altar, but their beauty felt hollow, wasted on what had become nothing more than a battlefield littered with broken pride. The candles still burned, but their flames flickered weakly, as though ashamed to witness what had unfolded beneath them. The wedding was over, not with joy, not with celebration, but with ruin. Juliet sat slumped at the foot of the altar, her gown wrinkled her veil, torn her face streaked with makeup and tears. The proud bride of an hour ago now looked like a ghost of her own ambition. Guests no longer whispered her name with admiration. They spat it with disgust, with pity, with contempt. Her parents huddled beside her, whispering urgently, but even they seemed deflated, their eyes darting toward the doors as if calculating how quickly they could escape the shame. My son, my Ethan, stood a few feet away, frozen. His shoulders sagged as though the weight of the entire church pressed down on them. His face was pale, drained of all confidence, all certainty. He looked at me, once his eyes filled with something that might have been regret, might have been shame, but the gulf between us was too wide. The bridge had burned long before that day. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. And then he looked away. The officiant quietly extinguished the candles, his hands steady, his expression unreadable. "This union cannot be blessed," he said simply, his voice echoing through the emptying hall. "Let what was spoken here today serve as a warning, not a celebration." Then he too left his robes trailing behind him, leaving us to the wreckage. I remained standing in the aisle watching them, the bride broken the groom, undone the parents of the bride, whispering frantic lies to themselves. And for the first time in months, I felt no weight pressing me down. Instead, I felt light, tall, unshakable. They had tried to bury me in silence, but I had risen louder than they could ever imagine. Word spread quickly. By the time I returned home that evening, the scandal was already moving like wildfire across the community. Neighbors called some to comfort me, others just to confirm the story. Strangers I barely knew stopped me in the street the next day, placing hands on my shoulder, saying, "We heard what happened. You were brave." The story no longer belonged to Juliet or her family. It had passed into the hands of the people, and with them, her reputation was shredded beyond repair. Juliet lost more than a wedding that day. She lost her place in society. Invitations that had once flowed to her like confetti dried up overnight. Friends she had boasted about vanished. Even her job, cushioned by her father's influence, began to wobble under the pressure of whispers. She had tried to steal dignity, but in the end, it was her own dignity that evaporated, leaving her hollow. As for my son, his collapse was quieter, but just as devastating. He moved out of Juliet's apartment within weeks. I heard from Margaret that he had been seen walking alone. His clothes rumpled his face, weary as though he had aged 10 years in a month. He never came to my door, never called, not even once. Perhaps shame kept him away. Perhaps loyalty to Juliet lingered. Or perhaps he simply didn't know how to face the truth. Whatever the reason, his absence was its own wound. But me, I walked differently after that day. My back straighter, my steps slower, but surer. The community looked at me not as a frail old woman, but as someone who had stood against cruelty and refused to break. For years, I had been invisible, the kind of woman who blended into the background. Now I was seen again, not because I wanted it, but because I had earned it. And yet, even in my victory, the sorrow remained. I had defended my dignity, reclaimed my voice, exposed the lies. But I had lost something too. My son was not the boy I had raised, not anymore. I could not undo his betrayal, nor could I erase the sound of his voice on that recording cold and certain, calling me weak. That wound would never heal completely. Justice had been served, but it was justice that came at a price. And in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by Robert's photographs and the plants I still tended, I whispered to him, "We won, Robert, but we lost our boy along the way." The aftermath was not triumph. It was balance restored, dignity reclaimed. It was truth standing tall while lies crumbled. And it was a reminder that betrayal may be punished, but it always leaves scars. In the days that followed, the world outside seemed to move on quickly. Weddings came and went, couples smiled in photographs, and life for the city continued as if nothing had happened. But for me, time slowed, every hour echoing with the memory of what had unfolded inside that church. The scent of roses lingered in my mind, not as a symbol of love, but as a reminder of how fragile illusions can be when truth slices through them. I returned to my apartment the morning after the wedding. For a long time, I simply stood in the doorway, staring at the familiar walls, the photographs, the quiet furniture bathed in sunlight. It was the same home it had always been, yet it felt different now. No longer a battleground, no longer a fragile place I might lose at any moment. It was mine again, truly mine. The silence was no longer heavy with fear. It was heavy with peace. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat in Robert's chair, and opened the window. The sound of children playing drifted in from the street below. I closed my eyes and imagined Robert sitting beside me, imagined him smiling softly, saying, "You did it, Aurora. You kept your promise." And for the first time in months, I allowed myself a small, genuine smile. But victory is never simple. With peace came grief. I walked to the shelf, touched the frame of Ethan's photograph, the little boy with a gap-toothed smile holding a wooden airplane. My hand lingered there, trembling. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who had chosen ambition and manipulation over love. I didn't know if I would ever see him again, or if he would ever have the courage to face me. The wound of his betrayal was still raw, and though the community had vindicated me, a mother's heart does not heal as easily as her reputation. And yet I felt something stir inside me, not forgiveness, not yet, but a kind of space, a door not open but not closed forever. Perhaps one day he would walk through it carrying regret instead of arrogance, humility instead of pride. If that day came, I would listen. But until then, I would live. The community center of whispers had already begun to shift. Neighbors who once dismissed me as fragile now greeted me with respect. People stopped me at the market, telling me I had inspired them to stand up for themselves. Even strangers sent letters thanking me for showing that age is not weakness, that silence is not surrender. I had not set out to be a symbol, but in defending my dignity, I had become one. I began writing more. At first, it was just memories, small stories of my life with Robert, of Ethan's childhood, of the laughter that once filled these walls. But as the pages grew, I realized I was not just writing for myself. I was writing for others, for women who had been silenced, for parents who had been betrayed, for anyone who had been told their time had passed. Words, I discovered, are not just weapons. They are seeds. And once planted, they grow in the hearts of others. Months passed. The scandal of the ruined wedding became a story told in whispers, a cautionary tale parents shared with their children. Juliet disappeared from society, her name spoken only with pity or contempt. My son remained absent, his silence cutting deeper than any insult. But I carried on one day at a time, building a life not on bitterness, but on resilience. And then one spring afternoon, as I tended to Robert's roses, I thought of Loretta from across the street, a widow like me, who had always wanted a small space for community gatherings. That was when the idea came to use what strength I had left, not to dwell on the past, but to create something lasting, something that would outlive betrayal. I called it the House of Dignity. It wasn't grand, just a modest community space in the basement of the building where neighbors could meet, share meals, read, and remind one another that no one is ever too old, too poor, or too broken to matter. The first meeting was small, 5 women, 2 men, all with stories of being pushed aside. We shared coffee, tears, and laughter, and as the evening ended, one of them whispered to me, "Thank you for giving us a place to belong." That night, as I locked the doors, I looked up at the stars and whispered to Robert, "We built more than a home. We built a legacy." And so my story ends not in despair, but in rebirth. Betrayal tried to silence me, but it gave me a louder voice. Humiliation tried to erase me, but it carved me deeper into the hearts of those who witnessed it. I lost my son, at least for now, but I found my dignity. And with it, I found a new family in the community that rose up around me. So I ask you, those who have walked with me through this story, what would you have done? If your own child stood by as their spouse humiliated you, would you forgive? Would you wait? Or would you rise, even broken, and reclaim the dignity they tried to steal? Remember, this money can buy houses, rings, and gowns, but it cannot buy respect. Power can intimidate, but it cannot create loyalty. Only truth lived and spoken builds legacies that last. As for me, I sit now in Robert's chair, the roses blooming outside, the laughter of neighbors drifting through the open window. I am not weak. I am not forgotten. I am Aurora Hughes, and I have learned that dignity is not a gift others can give or take away. It is a fire inside us, one that grows brighter when the night tries hardest to put it out. And to anyone listening who has ever felt erased, silenced, betrayed, know this: your story isn't over, not until you say it is.